My name is Eli Paul, and I'm the head of the library's Missouri Valley Special Collections. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to tell you about the program we started this year, Missouri Valley Sundays. This being Sunday, of course, and we being in such close proximity to the Missouri Valley Room over there. That is the place here on the 5th floor where we at the library preserve and make available to you the Missouri Valley Special Collections of rare library and archival materials. On select Sundays, we are open at 1 o'clock when the library doors open and remain open to the public until 5 p.m. I invite you to drop by to the Missouri Valley Room after today's talk. And if you have a particular question, burning or otherwise, our friendly and knowledgeable staff will be there to help. Today we have Sherry. Sherry's in the back. Raise your hand. Very good. And Stephanie, who's at the desk right now. They can get you connected to the treasures in our research library. 40,000 volumes, thousands of photographs, and hundreds of maps. And then if you don't have the time today, pick up one of our brochures or go to our website, kchistory.org, which, by the way, Sherry had so much in putting together. It is content-rich with easy-to-find stuff. Anyway, it's time to turn to today's program, which is generously supported by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Blair Kerkhoff is a familiar name if you read the sports section of the Kansas City Star and want to know anything about the college game in our region. Blair is a proud alumnus of Appalachian State, the little school of Boone, North Carolina, the Mountaineers that knocked off Michigan in that David and Goliath football game about 5 years ago. He's been covering college sports at the Star since 1989, and besides his reporting, has written several books, including The Greatest Book of College Basketball, Upon Further Review, Controversy in Sports Officiating, and A Century of Jayhawk Triumphs, the 100 Greatest Victories in the History of Kansas Basketball. How many MU games figure in that, I wonder? A few. His talk today is going to serve as a sneak preview to his next book, Tournament Town, which will focus on our fair city and its basketball history. But even before that, I knew we had a great topic for a Missouri Valley Sunday. That came when I read his feature story last year in the Star on the title, Hoop's Role in Social Change. It also had the subtitle, a very long subtitle, NAIA Tournament Made History by Being a Force for Progress in the Sport and in KC, especially in knocking down racial barriers. I learned so much from that article, and it meant a little bit more to me than the next person, I think. Why? I was a member of one of those little Missouri high school basketball teams that made the long ride in March of 1970 to see a day of NAIA games in Municipal Auditorium. What a great experience. Okay, I can admit now that I ditched the tournament to wander around downtown, which was quite an eye-opening experience right there for me. I sort of had my own Ferris Bueller day off that day, but I digress. We made it back in time that night for the showcase game of the day, which was featuring the appropriately named Kentucky State Thoroughbreds, which had the great player Travis Machine Gun Grant, who at that time was averaging 37 points a game on a team that averaged over 100. And he was ably assisted by 7-footer Elmore Smith. So we underage teenagers who had sneaked into all sorts of places during the day had no trouble escaping our nosebleed cheap seats to get near to the court so we can see these young basketball gods that we looked up to. Us and over 10,000 other people were there at that game. It was a great experience. So that's what the NAIA means to me. Little did I know what went on, though, to get those teams from historically black colleges to our town. I'm sure there are countless tournament stories to be heard, and we are so fortunate today in having the right person here at the Kansas City Public Library to share some of those with us. Please welcome Blair Kerkhoff.
Eli, thank you very much for a generous introduction. You all might have noticed the first photograph in our PowerPoint presentation is a University of Kansas photograph. I can assure you that we will be switching out of here in just a moment. As Eli said, I have been at the Kansas City Star since 1989. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is the heart of ACC country, Tobacco Road. I grew up in the era of David Thompson and those teams at North Carolina State. I used to sneak into Reynolds Coliseum and watch basketball games there. My first job was in Roanoke, Virginia, so I went from Raleigh to Roanoke, Virginia, again, still in the heart of ACC country. And in 1989, I came to the Kansas City Star. And when I did, I counted myself so fortunate to have gone from one area of the country that loves college basketball to this one. And since I've been at the Star, I've done nothing but cover college sports for almost a quarter century, and I'm very appreciative for that opportunity. When I got here, I learned that college basketball means a lot of things and a lot of different things to a lot of people in Kansas City. If you're a Kansas fan, it means countless games at Municipal Auditorium, at Kemper Arena, and at Sprint Center, and it might mean good memories of the 1988 National Championship game celebration. That's Danny Manning right under the trophy, and several holding him up and holding up the trophy. This was at Kemper Arena, of course, in 1988. If you're a Missouri fan, several conference championships were won at Kemper Arena under the coaching of Norm Stewart. There's Norm clipping down the nets, pretty happy. If you're a Kansas State fan, they won 2 of the first 3 Big 8 tournaments down in Kemper Arena, and that's Orlando Blackman, one of the great Kansas State players celebrating one of those conference championships. Kansas City is where UMKC calls home. Small colleges throughout this region were playing college basketball before they were playing college football. But if you're a fan of the NAIA tournament, or if you follow sports in Kansas City in the 50s, college basketball in Kansas City might mean something entirely different to you. And to you, it might be more than just a basketball game. And that's because college basketball played a role in the social change in downtown Kansas City. It helped open hotels and restaurants and theaters to people of all color. And this happened because the NAIA tournament had become such an important sporting event in Kansas City. And I don't know if the NAIA would have been able to continue and grow as an important sporting event if they had not opened the doors to integration in the late 1940s and the 1950s. Okay, so let's do this. Let's work our way up to that point, a time right after World War II, and talk a little bit about what was going on in Kansas City sports-wise, first in the white community and also in the African American community in Kansas City. From a basketball standpoint, the Kansas City by World War II had already become well established as a basketball capital. In 1905, there was a challenge series between the Kansas City Athletic Club and the Buffalo Germans. The Buffalo Germans were the Los Angeles Lakers of 1905. They were the Kentucky Wildcats. They were the kingpins of basketball. They had just won a gold medal at the St. Louis Olympics in 1904. And in 1905, this astute young entrepreneur basketball player named Forrest Allen decided to issue a challenge to the Buffalo Germans. He was 18 years old. He was a basketball player for the KCAC, and he just thought what a great opportunity this would be to bring a nationally recognized team to Kansas City. And again, his name was Forrest Allen, later known as Fog Allen. What happened was there had never been an event of this magnitude in the country, much less in Kansas City, a big challenge series basketball game. What Fog did, Forrest, he wasn't Fog yet, what Forrest did was he arranged for Convention Hall. There's Convention Hall. Convention Hall, by the way, was the building that is now where the Barney Alice Plaza is, between the Marriott and Municipal Auditorium. He arranged to get Convention Hall and put together this challenge series, this best of 3 games. The KCAC lost the first game that was officiated by a member of the Buffalo Germans. The Buffalo Germans lost the second game in a game that was officiated by a member of the KCAC. So with the third game, the teams decided they needed to get a neutral official. And who could they get? Who possibly could, the game was in Kansas City, who would they possibly get who was neutral on the subject of basketball, who could officiate this game? Well, it just so happens that watching all 3 games, or the first 2 games, and available to the third game to officiate it was none other than James Naismith, who was the inventor of the game of basketball, who by 1905 had been a professor at Kansas for about 7 years. So he agreed to officiate that third and final game and told both teams before the game, no rough stuff. We're going to play by my rules, my 13 original rules, and this is how it's going to be. Well, the KCAC ended up winning that game by about 30. Thousands of people attended these games, these 3 games. Thousands of people attended a basketball game before most people in the country knew what basketball even was. Now that event really helped influence Kansas City in the 1920s to get the National AAU Tournament. The National AAU Tournament was something that AAU has a whole different meaning in 1920 than it does today. We think about AAU as as youth basketball and, travel teams playing 8 games in one day, and anybody who's familiar with basketball has their own thought of what AAU basketball is. But in the 1920s and for most of the 20th century, the Amateur Athletic Union controlled all amateur sports in the United States. And for the first time in 1921, this AAU tournament comes to Kansas City, and it brings amateur teams from all over the country to Kansas City to play at Convention Hall. Kansas City just embraced this tournament and fell in love with it, and throughout the 1920s, put thousands of people inside Convention Hall. Thousands, and Kansas City was fortunate. The first few years of these events were won by Kansas City area teams. So the 1920s progresses. This is a wonderful event. Kansas City, often in the Star, is referred to as the Mecca of college basketball. I guess the Star had some hometown, that we felt pride about all this. And so the Kansas City would nobody else was calling themselves the Mecca of college basketball or amateur basketball, so why not us? So we did, and I think we were. For all the research I've done, there wasn't, basketball on an amateur level wasn't being played anywhere as successfully and with more interest than it was in Kansas City. Okay, the 1930s hit, the Depression hits, and suddenly the AAU tournament falls out of favor in Kansas City, and it moves on to Denver in 1935. But by then, the memory of that event helps inspire some people, a small group in Kansas City, to say, let's create our own tournament of college teams only. This AAU tournament could have been, it included high school teams, college teams, industrial teams, anything that was considered amateur, corporate teams. Now these small group of gentlemen in the mid-1930s say, let's create a tournament for college teams only. Well, they turned to the KUs and the Missouris and the Nebraskas and tried to invite them at first, and their people are saying there's a rule in our conference that we can't have postseason basketball. But there isn't such a rule for small colleges. So the Central Missouris, the Benedictines, those schools in the Kansas City area agree to be part of this small college basketball tournament. And in 1937, the tournament that would become known as the NAIA, it wasn't known that in 1937 when it started, launched. And it was a little underwhelming at first, only 8 teams, but it was thrown together so quickly, so hastily that it was just good that they got the thing off the ground. And that tournament was won by the Central University, the school known today as Central Missouri. The Mules also won the second tournament in 1938, and by then, the tournament had grown, more participation, and World War II comes, and the NAIA, the tournament that would soon be known as the NAIA tournament, is growing in attendance, it's growing in participation, and it's becoming a big attraction to small colleges around the country. Okay, so that brings us through World War II, college basketball in, let's say, white Kansas City. And let me take a stab now at what the sports world was like in Kansas City for the African American community. And forgive me for being incomplete here. Most of the information I have comes from interviews that I've done over the years, and also from the newspapers, the Kansas City Star and the Kansas City Times, which actually did a very good job of covering sports in the Kansas City area in the 20s, 30s, 40s, whether it was black or white. But they obviously didn't thoroughly cover everything in the African American community. What they didn't cover, the Kansas City Call did, wonderfully, by the way. And I'm sure they did it with limited resources and staff. So I got to read a lot of the microfilm of the Kansas City Call as well. So this is what we've pieced together about what's going on in the Kansas City black community sports-wise, up until World War II. And we know it's a good place to start always. Whoops, that's the KCAC team of 1921 that won the first AAU tournament. This is the Kansas City Monarchs, pride and joy of the African American community, not just in Kansas City, but throughout the country. 1924 Negro League champions, and just one of the great sports entities in the history of Kansas City. Broke all kinds of barriers. Here's what the Kansas City Call had to say about the Monarchs in the 1930s and the way Kansas City embraced the Monarchs. From a sociological point of view, the Monarchs have done more than any single agent in Kansas City to break the damnable outrage of prejudice that exists in this city. You had white fans and black fans sitting together at Monarchs games in the 1930s. I'm not sure where else that might have happened anywhere in Kansas City. But mostly, sports in Kansas City was very separate and unequal, especially in the high schools and colleges. Segregated high schools had their own organization. It was called the Missouri Negro Interscholastic Athletic Association. And just by reading the call, I learned it was a pretty big deal when the Lincoln High Tigers played the RT Cole Jeeps. The Negro Association sponsored state championships in basketball and football, and I think at its height there were about 45 schools in that association. At the college level, the African American community was more interested in what was going on in the Big Ten than they were in the Big Six. The Big Six at the time, of course, was Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa State, Oklahoma, Kansas State. Now, why was that? Well, the Big Six wasn't integrated through the 1940s, through World War II. But the Big Ten was, with athletes like Jesse Owens. And if you're an African American in high school in the 1930s and 40s in Kansas City, and you wanted to play college sports, you couldn't go to Kansas or Missouri or K-State or any of our local schools to play. You had to go to Lincoln in Jeff City, or you had to go to Langston in Oklahoma, or you went to some of the eastern schools, the schools in the southeast, like the schools we know today as North Carolina Central or Tennessee State or Texas Southern down in Texas. In 1940, I found this amusing. In 1943, the Call pointed out that while Missouri played in a 30,000-seat stadium on campus, Lincoln and Jeff City played on a patch of swampland 3 miles from the campus. Boxing matches were a big deal in Kansas City in the 30s and the 40s, but there was segregated seating in KCK, at Memorial Hall, and at Municipal Auditorium in Kansas City. So that's just a snapshot, an incomplete one at best, but a snapshot of what it was like in the African American community sports-wise through the 1940s. Okay, so that brings us to right after World War II. It's the mid to late 1940s, and colleges in the Northeast and the Midwest are starting to open their doors more to African American students and teams as well. There's a college in Iowa, Morningside College up in Iowa, and it qualified for the NAIA tournament in 1946. The Morningside team had a player on its roster named Rosamond Wilson, who was African American. He was a reserve. He didn't get into many games, but when Morningside qualified for the NAIA tournament in 1946, he wasn't allowed to play. He had to sit on the bench, and even if the coach wanted to put him in, he couldn't do it. Couldn't even stay with his team in hotels here. Had to stay at the Paseo YMCA. There were enough people at that tournament in 1946 who were pretty angry over that situation, but real change to the NAIA didn't come until 2 years later, in 1948. 1948 was an Olympic year. That's important. The NAIA had been told by the AAU, which was still overseeing the Olympics and teams in the American teams in the Olympics, that the NAIA champion could be part of the Olympic qualifying tournament. That's a big deal. That would have given the NAIA, which is already on an upward path of recognition and credibility in the college basketball world, could have its champion be part of the Olympic tournament. That would have been huge. But the AAU told the NAIA that can't happen if you have a segregated tournament. Now remember, this is 1948. Jackie Robinson had only been, in the major leagues for a year. He got in 1947. There were no African American players in professional basketball. The NFL was slow to integrate. College basketball, very slow to integrate. There wasn't an African American player for an NCAA champion until 1950. Still very much a segregated sports world. But in 1948, with a little push from the Olympics, the NAIA said, we're done. We're going to rescind our segregation policy, and any team that qualifies with an African American player will be allowed to play. And that player, of course, will be allowed to play. And one team had such a player that qualified. Indiana State University, Terre Haute, Indiana. You may recognize the coach on the upper left there. That's John Wooden. John Wooden was in his second year as the head coach at Indiana State. He had a player on that team, I think he wasn't a senior, second or third year, named Clarence Walker. Bottom right there. Walker wasn't a starter, but he was a member of the team. And John Wooden said, we would not bring that team to Kansas City. In fact, a year before, when Indiana State qualified to come to Kansas City, John Wooden didn't bring his team here because of the NAIA segregation policy. The policy was lifted. John Wooden asked Clarence Walker if he would feel comfortable playing, being the person who broke the color barrier in Kansas City. Walker said he would. And when Indiana State took the floor for its first game in Kansas City in 1948, Walker didn't start, but he was the first sub off the bench. And again, I'll go back to the Kansas City call. And here's what John Johnson, the sports editor of the call, had to say. The crowd awaited his appearance. Even vendors stopped plying their trade to watch. Walker won the admiration of the crowd, for he was applauded loudly as he left the floor for a replacement. And that's how in 1948, before the NBA or the NCAA tournament was integrated, the NAIA had shown the way. But there were more obstacles to overcome. Historically black colleges also wanted a place to play. They had tried to get into the NCAA tournament, but the NCAA tournament had told them, no, you're not good enough to play in our tournament. And the coaches for these historically black colleges shot back and said, how would you know we're not good? The teams in this part of the country, the white teams, won't play us. So the historically black colleges turned to the NAIA. And at this point, the NAIA is being run by a man named Al Dewar, who was he was a Kansan, and he happened to be a coach for the team that in 1946 played the game right after the Morningside, Iowa team had played, and saw the whole thing, saw that Rosamond Wilson not be able to get into the game, and he was touched by that, and he was affected by that. And he used that argument to help persuade the board of the NAIA to help to close this loophole and let historically black colleges in the NAIA tournament. And in 1952, after the 52 event, the NAIA voted unanimously to allow historically black colleges in its tournament. This was a great moment. All these schools in the South and the Southwest, from Baltimore to Raleigh to Atlanta to Baton Rouge to Jackson, Mississippi, to Oklahoma to Texas, were now going to be able to be part of an integrated tournament. And there was great joy in the African American community based on the research that I did, but leave it to one guy to shrug his shoulders at the whole thing. Clarence Big House Gaines. You tell me which one's Big House here, and you know him. He's the coach at Winston-Salem State. At the time, he too was happy about having historically black colleges in the NAIA tournament. But what he said later I thought was really interesting. What the NAIA had done was basically create a separate district for historically black colleges. Whereas the whole NAIA tournament was about winning your region and coming to Kansas City to represent your region or district, the NAIA had said all the black colleges would be part of one district and its champion would come to Kansas City. And it was Big House who said, well, wait a second, what you've done essentially is create a national black college tournament with only one winner. We could have multiple winners come to Kansas City if we were allowed to play in our region. But it was kind of a one-step-at-a-time thing. And in 1953, for the first time, a historically black college came to Kansas City to participate in its tournament. And that was the school called Tennessee A&I. They won 2 games in Kansas City that year. They came back the next year, 1954, and lost their opening game. At that point, Tennessee A&I changed coaches, and this ends up being a pretty big moment for the NAIA for history, because they hire a fellow named John McClendon. I hope he's the next, yes, he is. They hired John McClendon as their head coach. Now, it's a shame we haven't mentioned John McClendon yet, but we're going to talk more about him in a minute. But what you need to know about John McClendon is he had an insatiable appetite for winning. He believed that one of the best ways to improve his team was to make sure they played against top-notch competition in the regular season. He wanted his team to play in 1954. The NAIA sponsored a Christmas tournament, and he wanted his team to be part of that Christmas tournament. And the invitation was accepted by the NAIA, but that wasn't good enough for McClendon. He didn't want his team being treated like second-class citizens when they came to Kansas City. He didn't want them staying away from other teams. He didn't want them eating in different restaurants. He wanted his Tennessee State teams, now it's Tennessee State, to be treated like every other team in the field. And it was. The team was assigned the Hotel Kansas City, located at 11th and Baltimore. The story was, I don't know if it's an urban legend or not, but I had enough people tell me that the maids quit in protest over this. Black team staying at the Hotel Kansas City. So what did McClendon do? He asked his players to make the beds that week, and they did. To top it off, Tennessee State beat Rockhurst in the championship of that Christmas tournament. The next season, the NAIA opened its field for more than one historically black college. And in 1957, McClendon brought his Tennessee State team to the postseason tournament in Kansas City. And it was truly a great Tennessee State team. There was 3 future NBA players on that team. There's Municipal Auditorium, by the way. 3 future NBA players on the 1957 Tennessee State team. They were fast, they ran like the wind, and they lit up the scoreboard like a pinball machine. They came to Kansas City and won their way through the bracket all the way to the championship game. And in the title game, they met a very good team from Oklahoma. But this year, nothing was going to stop Tennessee State. And in 1957, the first historically black college won an integrated tournament. One of the players from that team was a gentleman named Nerland Tarrant. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I hope I am. He remembered visiting an elementary school after the season, an African-American school, and just remembered the kids being so excited. He remembered them saying, they let you play against the white teams and you beat them. And Nerland Tarrant told me, there's the Tennessee State team there, told me in 2007, the 50th anniversary of that championship, we felt like we were Jackie Robinson or Joe Louis. But one championship wasn't enough for this group. They won it again in 1958 and 1959 and became the first college basketball team to win more than 2 national championships in a row. Okay, so now it's 1959. Black athletes are sprinkled in professional sports, college basketball, and football. But in Kansas City, let me back up a second, sorry about that. Let's talk a little bit more about John McClendon. I think John McClendon there have been books written about John, and there have been documentaries written about John, and yet I still think he's one of the most underappreciated men in the history of sports. I mentioned he was from KCK. He was born in Hiawatha, Kansas. He was a son of an African-American father and an American Indian mother. The family moved to KCK when he was young, and he went to Dunbar Elementary, Northeast Junior High, and Sumner. He was an average athlete. He was only 5'6", but he loved sports, and he loved sports knowledge. He loved soaking up, coaching ideas in sports. He was the first person to attend Kansas as a physical education major. And the reason he went to Kansas in the first place was because he knew James Naismith was was teaching physical education there. But to get his PE degree, McClendon had to take any PE major at Kansas in the 1930s had to take a swimming test. The problem was, in the mid-1930s, swimming pools were off limits to African Americans. James Naismith and Fogg Allen, who was also at Kansas by this time, said, look, we'll give you a pass on the swimming test. You're obviously a great, you're overqualified to be a PE major. But McClendon said, no, every other student has to take the swimming test. I'm going to take the swimming test. And McClendon made a deal with Naismith and Allen. He said, if you open the pool to everybody for 2 weeks and there's no incident, then you've got to let me take that swimming test. and Naismith and Allen agreed to it. And what McClendon did is he went to the 60 other or so African-American students at Kansas and told them to stay away from the swimming pool for 2 weeks. There were no incidents at the swimming pool. And that's all that Naismith and Allen knew. There were no incidents at the swimming pool. They let him take the swimming test, and he passed. Of course, he was a lifeguard when he was in high school. So McClendon got his PE degree on his terms. When McClendon, his first coaching job came at North Carolina, the school we know today is North Carolina Central in Durham. But in 1944, McClendon arranged a game between his team and a team from Duke University. They were medical students there. They were graduate students. They weren't members of the varsity, but there were a lot of former college basketball players there. This is in 1944 in North Carolina. McClendon wanted to bring teams together. He wanted to bring people together. This Duke team agreed to play him. It was on a Sunday morning. McClendon knew he had to keep this game top secret. If anybody knew about it, if anybody found out, he thought that there'd be funding cut off for his school, state funding cut off for his school. So on Sunday morning, these Duke players, these Duke athletes, medical students, got in separate cars and took separate routes over to this college, North Carolina Central campus. And they ended up playing a game against each other at 11 in the morning on a Sunday in March in 1944. Central won the game in a blowout by about 40 points. And afterwards, the players traded teams, they played shirt and skins games, and just made an afternoon of it. Nobody knew about this game until 1996. It's when he finally opened up and talked about it. After his Tennessee State days, which ended with the third national championship in 1959, McClendon wanted to coach an integrated team, and he became the head coach of the Cleveland Pipers of something called the National Industrial Basketball League. And a year later, that team moved into what was called the American Basketball League. There was a Kansas City team in that league. And that was started as a rival to the NBA, but by becoming the coach, by that team moving into that league, it made John McClendon the first black coach of a professional basketball team in an integrated league. The list of firsts continued for him. In 1966, he became the first black coach at a predominantly white university at Cleveland State. And 3 years later, he became the first black coach in the ABA. Remember, the old rival to the NBA. You know, when I think of John McClendon, I think a lot about Buck O'Neil and the comparisons between those two. I've heard it mentioned a lot. I think Buck O'Neil gained a lot of publicity and notoriety, especially late in his career. And for some reason, I think that same kind of notoriety is passed on, has been forgotten about John McClendon. I still say he's one of the greatest sportsmen in the history, not only of college basketball, but in sports. Okay, so now we're up to the 1960s. This was the Tennessee State Championship in 1959. We're up to the 1960s, and college basketball in Kansas City is now as equal opportunity as it is anywhere in the country. But here's where Kansas City really benefits from segregation in the South. Segregation is still a way of life in the South, the Southeast, the Southwest, which means if you're an African-American athlete, you either had to go to the historically black colleges of the South, or you came into the Big Ten, or now by this time, certainly Kansas and Kansas State and Missouri were integrated. But if you were from Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama, you had to go to a historically black college in the South. Those teams remained in the NAIA. So what this meant was these schools, these athletes who played for NAIA schools in the South won their district. Now they're in separate districts, and brought these teams came into Kansas City. So what Kansas City got to witness in the 1960s were players like Willis Reed from Grambling, Luke Jackson. These are Tennessee State guys. We'll go back and talk a little bit more. There's Luke Jackson, Texas Pan American, Zelmo Beatty from Prairie View A&M, Earl the Pearl Monroe from Winston-Salem State, and that's just a fraction of the future stars that came through Municipal Auditorium in the 1960s. And the cool thing about the NAIA, the really cool thing about the NAIA this time of year was, in this era, in the 1960s, there were great local teams as well. Rockhurst in 1964 beats Luke Jackson's team to win the NAIA championship of '64. St. Benedict's, the school we know today as Benedictine, wins the 1967 NAIA championship. So you've got these wonderful athletes coming from schools in the South competing against solid teams from the Kansas City area. And the NAIA tournament now is drawing 10,000 people a session. The Rockhurst Texas Pan American Games set an attendance record for Municipal Auditorium. Almost 11,000 people, played or witnessed that game that night. Through the 1970s and the 1980s, the interest in college basketball certainly remained strong in Kansas City. The opening of Kemper Arena in 1974 really accelerated the growth of basketball in the Big Eight, and it brought the NCAA tournament back as far as regionals go. The previous NCAA visit here was in 1964, where John Wooden's UCLA team won the first of his national championships. They had gone away because they had outgrown municipal, but with Kemper Arena now open in 1974, you had a place where the Big Eight felt comfortable and the NCAA as well. Of course, 1988, Kansas wins the national championship at Kemper. Then we get to the 1990s, and a lot of great change is happening now in Kansas City. The NCAA moves its national office to Indianapolis. The Big Eight merges with the 4 Texas schools, and the Big Eight office closes in Kansas City. The Big 12 opens in Dallas. And maybe the move that hurt as much as any was the NAIA packing up and leaving, going to Tulsa, Oklahoma after the 1993 tournament. Its national office in Tulsa. But the new millennium brought a great response from Kansas City. We built the Sprint Center. We opened the College Basketball Hall of Fame and the CBE. And what that did was brought a great regular season college basketball tournament here and the Hall of Fame. The NAIA came back, and some great, great games. This is a picture from the 4 overtime semifinal game. This wasn't even the end of the game. This was descended to this reaction shot from Concordia, a little school in California, sent it into like the third or fourth overtimes. The NABC decided to stay in Kansas City, and that really did inspire the development downtown that included the Sprint Center. The whole thing, Kansas City, college basketball, probably, maybe now we can say is as healthy it's as ever been. And now we're a couple of weeks away from March. March brings back the NAIA tournament, the MIAA, which is one of the strongest Division II tournaments or Division II leagues in college basketball. The Big 12 is here starting March 7th, and the NCAA tournament's coming back next year for an early round game. But it's more than half a century ago that great and positive change came to Kansas City. When I moved here, I never thought of Kansas City as really being on the cutting edge of much of anything, sort of a go along, get along town. But when it came to college basketball, because of a few enlightened people, it went where college basketball had never been before. And we're all better for it, and I'm proud to be a Kansas Citian because of it. Thank you very much.